The visual is not important here. The music is not important here. The voice is not important here. What matters are the words. If you cannot listen to the words, you do not belong here. If you understand this, welcome to the Fate Club. In the low planes of existence, the body hurts in ways that were once normalized, and the suffering of drinking and smoking is no longer hidden behind habit or social permission, but felt directly in the nervous system as pressure, anxiety, and a quiet internal refusal that grows without drama. What once soothed now agitates, what once numbed now sharpens discomfort, and the substances that were used to descend into forgetfulness begin to feel like an unnatural gravity pulling the organism against its own direction of movement. This is not a moral shift and not a collective agreement, but a biological and perceptual mismatch between an older coping architecture and a changing internal environment that no longer tolerates descent into dense states. The body becomes less forgiving, the mind less willing, and the emotional field less capable of sustaining the frequencies required to maintain addiction without immediate consequence. Smoking begins to feel heavy before the first inhale is finished, not as guilt, but as a subtle constriction in the chest and a sense of being pulled backward while everything else is moving forward. Alcohol loses its promise slowly, first as a delayed anxiety that appears the next morning without a clear cause, then as an unease that arrives during the act itself, making intoxication feel exposed rather than protected. Drugs that once created expansion begin to fracture perception, producing restlessness instead of escape, tension instead of release, and a sense that the nervous system is being overstimulated in a direction it no longer recognizes as safe. The individual does not decide to stop in a single moment, but begins to pause more often, to delay, to forget, and to notice that the urge no longer aligns with the internal state that is forming. Addiction in this context is revealed not as a personal weakness, but as a compatibility issue between consciousness and a set of external agents that require a certain density to function smoothly. As perception subtly shifts, the pathways that once welcomed chemical interference begin to reject it, creating anxiety not because something is wrong, but because something is no longer aligned. The low vibrational ranges that allowed repeated descent through smoking, drinking, and drug use become increasingly inaccessible, as if the floor itself is lifted and the old doors now open into discomfort rather than relief. People begin to experience this as confusion at first, then as fatigue, and finally as a quiet disengagement that happens without resistance. There is a growing inability to remain numb for long periods, not because numbness is forbidden, but because it no longer holds. The system wants coherence, and substances that fragment perception create immediate feedback in the form of inner pressure, accelerated thoughts, shallow breathing, and a sense of internal misplacement. This feedback is often interpreted as anxiety, yet it is not an illness, but a signal that the organism cannot maintain the previous contract with these substances. What once lowered awareness now overstimulates it, and the attempt to descend produces friction instead of escape. As this friction increases, the old dependencies begin to dissolve not through force, but through loss of utility. Cigarettes stop working as anchors, alcohol stops working as social lubricant, and drugs stop working as portals, leaving behind only the physiological cost without the perceived benefit. The body remembers the transaction clearly and begins to refuse it, creating a natural distancing that feels like loss at first, but gradually reveals itself as relief. People notice they can no longer go as low as before without paying an immediate internal price, and over time they stop attempting to reach those levels altogether. Within older frameworks, these dependencies were not isolated behaviors, but interfaces through which reverse systems operated, feeding on repetition, numbness, and lowered awareness. These systems require consistent access to dense emotional states, predictable cycles of craving and relief, and a nervous system trained to override its own signals. As human perception shifts, these interfaces lose stability, and the parasitic structures that depended on them find fewer entry points. This does not happen through battle or resistance, but through obsolescence, as the environment they relied on quietly disappears. The entities once described as external are better understood as patterns that could only sustain themselves through resonance with fear, avoidance, and unconscious repetition. As people become less able to tolerate these states internally, the patterns lose coherence and detach naturally. This detachment is often felt as withdrawal without substance, as a strange emptiness where a habit once lived, followed by an unfamiliar clarity that does not ask to be named. The individual may grieve the loss of the familiar descent, yet simultaneously sense that something oppressive has loosened its grip. In the transition from dense, survival-based consciousness into subtler modes of perception, the body becomes the first translator of change. It speaks through discomfort, through sudden intolerance, and through a refusal to cooperate with habits that once seemed inseparable from identity. This shift is gradual and uneven, unfolding across months or years, often unnoticed until a substance is offered, and the system responds with quiet rejection. There's no announcement and no milestone, only the growing sense that returning to old behaviors would require an effort that no longer feels natural. Smoking becomes associated with anxiety rather than calm, alcohol with fragmentation rather than connection, and drugs with dissonance rather than insight. The nervous system begins to prefer clarity over stimulation, stillness over artificial modulation, and presence over chemical alteration. This preference is not ideological but physiological, as the system recalibrates toward a different baseline of awareness. The old rewards fade not because they are condemned, but because they no longer match the internal signal the body is learning to follow. As this recalibration continues, the idea of forcing oneself to quit becomes irrelevant. People simply stop reaching for what no longer fits, often surprised by how little struggle is involved once the alignment shifts. Cravings appear less frequently and dissolve more quickly, as if the underlying engine that produced them has lost momentum. What remains is a period of adjustment where the absence of old habits reveals spaces that must now be inhabited consciously. These spaces are sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes quiet, and sometimes filled with an unfamiliar neutrality that feels empty only because it is new. Without constant chemical interruption, emotions move differently, thoughts slow down, and the sense of time becomes less urgent. The individual begins to experience life without the need to punctuate it with artificial peaks and valleys. This evenness can feel strange in a culture built on stimulation, yet it carries a stability that gradually becomes recognizable. The ascension described in older language is not an escape from the body, but a refinement of how the body processes reality. Lower frequencies become harder to sustain, not because they are forbidden, but because the system has outgrown them. Just as certain foods become intolerable as metabolism changes, certain substances become incompatible with a nervous system that is reorganizing itself. The result is a quiet departure from addiction, unnoticed by the world, yet deeply felt by those undergoing the shift. The reverse systems that once thrived on unconscious repetition weaken as attention becomes more present, even without effort. The parasitic entities tied to addiction lose their grip as the host environment changes, unable to extract energy from a field that no longer resonates with them. This process is not dramatic and not visible, unfolding instead as a series of small refusals, delays, and forgotten impulses. Over time, the cumulative effect is profound, as entire populations begin to disengage from behaviors that once seemed structurally embedded. What replaces addiction is not virtue but coherence. The body and mind begin to operate as a single system rather than opposing forces negotiating relief. Anxiety decreases not because life becomes easier, but because the internal conflict created by self-interruption dissolves. People feel more sensitive, yet also more stable, less distracted, yet less driven by compulsion. This sensitivity makes dissent uncomfortable, and that discomfort acts as a natural boundary. Attempts to numb are met with immediate feedback, guiding the system back toward equilibrium. Over time, this feedback becomes trusted, and the old desire to override it fades. The individual learns to remain present without naming the process or claiming an identity around it. The low planes still exist, but fewer people can remain there for long. The suffering associated with drinking and smoking becomes a signal rather than a lifestyle. Drugs lose their illusion of transcendence and reveal their cost too quickly to ignore. The collective movement is subtle, almost invisible, yet it reshapes behavior from the inside out. This is how dependencies end in a world that is changing frequency, not through enforcement or ideology, but through incompatibility. The system evolves, and what cannot adapt quietly falls away. Humanity does not rise by rejecting the past, but by outgrowing it. The addictions dissolve because the conditions that sustain them no longer exist in the same form. If you understand this, welcome to the club.